These are the lecture notes for Chapter 31 on animal organization and homeostasis. And beginning with this chapter, we're going to focus much more on the human organ systems and human organization rather than all animals. I may mention a few things just so you can have a comparison, but I'm going to focus the exam questions and material on the human body. So let's get started. We will cover the types of tissues in humans and many other mammals. It's going to be 4 main tissue types: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle, epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle tissue. And then we will cover the 11 organ systems of the human body, as well as one organ system, the integumentary system, which is the skin and accessory organs like hair and nails and glands. And then we will cover homeostasis, how the human body maintains internal levels inside of our cells, basically, and uses our organ systems to maintain levels of important chemicals and important processes that go on, to keep us alive. So we will begin with the tissues. Tissues are collections of specialized cells of the same or similar type that perform a common function in the body. So the 4 tissue types are, and we will spend more time on the first 2, but they are epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissues. So we're going to start with the first tissue type, epithelial tissue. Where we find epithelial tissue is that it forms a continuous layer over body surfaces. So the outside layer of the skin, called the epidermis, that is epithelial tissue. The outside layer and inside layer of the heart, for example, it's lined on the outside and on the inside with epithelial tissue. So linings of body cavities, linings of the lining of the blood vessels and the intestines, epithelial tissue also, it forms glands. So if it's a gland, then it was formed from epithelial tissue. Epithelial cells have connections, and the connections can be tight junctions, which form a tight seal that won't allow materials to pass through. Adhesion junctions, which are stronger connections, but they're just at certain spots. I always like to compare them to like a spot weld. And then gap junctions, which are connections that have channels running through them so that ions can be passed from cell to cell very quickly throughout the tissue. And the functions of epithelial tissue include protection, secretion, absorption, excretion, and filtration. And we'll talk more about those functions as we go through the different tissue types. So we're going to learn first about the primary types of epithelial tissue and how they're named. First thing we do when we're naming epithelial tissue is you have to ask yourself, is this tissue a single layer of cells or multiple layers of cells? If it's a single layer of cells, we call it simple. And if all of those cells are flattened, we would call it simple squamous. If all of those cells are cube-shaped cells, we would call it simple cuboidal. And if all of those cells are tall, rectangular cells resembling columns, we would call it simple columnar epithelial tissue. We also have stratified squamous, which is layers of flat cells. We really won't go into the other stratified types, but if stratified comes before the cell type, that tells you it's layers of those cells, many layers of those cells. So then you can have pseudostratified epithelial tissue, which, this is wrong. I hate when this happens. I just for time's sake, because there's a lot in this chapter and the next, just pseudostratified appears layered, but it's not. Well, I will go ahead and fix it, as it doesn't need to be wrong. Okay, so this should actually be just stratified. I don't know why it's not. Stratified epithelia is layers of cells. Now, there is a type called pseudostratified. I'm going to make this red also. There we go. Much better. All right, there is a type called pseudostratified where it appears layered, but it's really just a single layer of cells. And then you have glandular epithelial tissue, and that is epithelial tissue that secretes a product. Now, a gland can be a single epithelial cell or many cells. And we have two types. Exocrine glands secrete products into ducts. And so that would be, for example, sweat glands, oil glands, mammary glands secrete their products into a duct and then onto a surface. And then endocrine glands secrete the products, which are hormones, into the bloodstream. So endocrine is always hormones and always travels through the bloodstream. Now let's look at some images. You have microscopic photographs, micrographs, as well as illustrations of the tissue type. So I want you to be able to recognize some of these basic tissue types and then also know the examples that I give you of where they're located. The primary example where we're going to find simple squamous epithelial tissue is lining the smallest blood vessels called capillaries. They're microscopic blood vessels. They're the tiniest blood vessels, and their function is diffusion. They allow for the diffusion of oxygen and nutrients into our tissues. So blood vessels are lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue, and also the air sacs of the lungs called alveoli. So those are the two examples I want you to know for the simple squamous epithelial tissue. And notice how if you look at the tissue from above it, like if you're looking like a bird's eye view, the cells are flattened and they almost look like irregular shaped fried eggs. You see the nucleus in the middle and then this big fat cell around it. If you look at it from the side, it would be a single layer of very flattened cells. Now, simple cuboidal, you're going to see these lining the kidney tubules called nephrons. And that's going to be a single layer of cuboidal shaped cells. Simple columnar, you will find lining the intestines. And this is what it looks like from the side. You see it both in the microscope image and also as an illustration. The nuclei are often lined up in a row. You can see them the nucleus lined in a row, and the cells are very tall. So this is what simple columnar epithelial tissue looks like. This tissue lines the small intestines, and the surface, the apical surface of this tissue, is covered in folds called microvilli. And that enables the tissue to have a larger surface area so it can absorb even more nutrients from that are broken down and digested from our food. So many more nutrients can be absorbed into this tissue than if they didn't have the microvilli or the folds on the surface, if it was just a flat surface. Then I told you we would encounter a tissue called pseudostratified. This tissue is actually called pseudostratified ciliated columnar. You can see that the tissue appears layered, but it's not. If you look at an illustration, you can see that all of the cells actually form a single layer and contact the basement membrane. So it's really a single layer of cells that appear layered under the microscope because of the different shape of the cells and how the nuclei are located in different areas. It looks like that it would be stratified tissue, but it's not. And pseudostratified columnar tissue is lined with cilia, or little hairs. And in the respiratory tract, what this does is it sweeps mucus and pathogens up and away from your lungs so that you can cough that out. You can cough it up, and it keeps you from having infections deep in your lungs. So we're going to find pseudostratified ciliated columnar tissue lining the trachea and the bronchi, the airways. And then stratified squamous is found in the upper layer of skin called the epidermis. And it also is going to line openings that open to the exterior, to the outside. So the nose, mouth, esophagus, anal canal, and vagina all are lined with stratified squamous epithelial tissue, layers of flattened cells. And then for glands, we call it a gland when the epithelial cells secrete a product. And we already talked about that there are two types. There are exocrine glands that secrete their product into a duct, like the sweat glands of the skin, and there are exocrine glands in the pancreas that secrete enzymes that travel through a duct onto the inside surface of your small intestine, and those enzymes help digest your food. So that's the exocrine function of your pancreas, but you may know that your pancreas also has endocrine glands that produce insulin, which is a hormone, and it's secreted through your bloodstream to help lower your blood sugar. So your pancreas actually functions as both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So now we're going to move on to connective tissue. The functions of connective tissue, this is your most diverse tissue for one. The functions are to establish a structural framework, to transport fluids and dissolved materials, because your bones and your cartilage are considered connective tissue, structural connective tissue, supportive connective tissue, and blood is a connective tissue, and it transports fluids. Then we have protects delicate organs, like fat tissue is a connective tissue. Support, surround, and interconnect tissues. Store energy reserves, again, fat or adipose tissue. And then defends the body from microorganisms, and that would be your lymphatic tissue, your tissue of your immune system. So, and this is just 6 functions. There's probably more if we were to really, really get detailed about it. This is an example of a typical connective tissue that has all of the different connective tissue cell types, all of the different fiber types, and the ground substance. So fibrous connective tissue is going to have sometimes all 3 protein fibers, but it's going to have a ground substance and protein fibers that forms what's called the matrix. And the matrix will surround the cells. So unlike the epithelial tissue, connective tissue has cells that are kind of scattered throughout a matrix. And the matrix consists of a ground substance, which can be fluid like blood plasma. It can be solid like in bone tissue, or it can be more like a syrup like you would have in this fibrous connective tissue. But the ground substance and the fibers make up the matrix. The fibers can be elastic fibers. These little thin fibers here are elastic fibers, or these thick collagen fibers, or even reticular fibers, which are very thin and kind of form a branching network. Some of the cells of connective tissue include adipose or fat cells, stem cells that can divide and produce other cells, like whenever your tissues, one of the things is that your tissues can function in repair and growth. And then we have fibroblasts that produce these fibers. We have white blood cells that engulf pathogens and destroy them. So all different types of cells and fibers and ground substance that makes up connective tissue.